Dear Bruno Latour, dear colleagues, dear commilitones, so to say. It's our second lecture evening of the this year Albertus-Magnus Professorship. So I must not say very much to introduce our Albertus-Magnus Professor, which already is in no way necessary, but it is a gesture we always do. But we are here now in the working period of our Albertus-Magnus chair, second evening lecture after the seminar we had yesterday, and tomorrow another one. So I'm looking forward to the lecture, and after the lecture, comme d'habitude, there will be plenty of time for discussion. So we are looking forward to a very interesting evening.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I was expecting, in fact, to talk to you after having read the Pope encyclic. 2 days, it was supposed to be published tomorrow. There was a leak document that Andreas kindly sent me, but unfortunately my Italian is not good enough, and I couldn't get it. The 168 pages of the encyclic, a nice case of religion and politics linked to ecology, but I advise you to go to the YouTube and find the very funny film where the Pope is transformed into a sort of Superman and fighting with his cross the bad guys who are climato-skeptics and roaming around the world with his encyclic to try to save the planet in the name of Catholic religion. Very funny. So what I'm going to do nonetheless is a pre-commentary, so to speak, of one, I hope, point in the encyclic around this question of what does it mean to live at the end of time. The reason is, since I've been working on ecology in the way I mentioned last Monday, I often get the replic and the objection that this is an apocalyptic discourse, and that even many scientists who are working in this question are accused of being apocalyptic. Now I have to remember this thing it says here. And as you know, the great climato-skeptic, who happens to be the head of the Environment Committee in the US Congress, has mentioned the Bible several times and the promise that God made after the flood that there will be no other flood. And thus, as he said in the Congress, all the science of climate who says that there is a danger of losing the planet is certainly not true, because the promise of God is, of course, stronger than climate science. So I got interested into this argument, and the link between ecology and apocalypse is important on many, many aspects. One of them is, of course, that in the sort of banal sense of the word apocalyptic, what scientists say and the reason why we are so frightened is apocalyptic in a sort of a Hollywood definition of apocalypse. Let's say catastrophist. But there is a deeper sense, and this is the one which I'd like to explore with you. My argument, and I think it's better to state the argument at the onset, and then we can discuss what would be your reaction to it, is that those who accuse ecologists, by ecologists I mean mainly scientists, but not only scientists, activists of many sorts, and citizens, and of course now more and more many members of the clergy, when they accuse them of being apocalyptic, they themselves, those who, like the head of the Environmental Committee of the Congress, are apocalyptic in another sense. They believe they are beyond the apocalypse or before the apocalypse, but not in it, not in the time. So they are slightly in a sort of disruption of time, and I think that's the main reason. There are many others, of course, but one of the main reasons of simultaneous climato-skepticism and the sort of indifference, or I like to say quietism, in which we all take this question of ecology. If we had any of those news coming from the scientists about the ocean, the air, the atmosphere, the soil, we would already be doing something. Actually, we would already have solved the problem because it's not that difficult. The problem is that we hear the alarm, we hear the sound, we hear the trumpet, and we say, well, après moi le déluge. So it's the situation, the discrepancy between the size of a threat articulated by the science as the sort of laid-back, quiet attitude which interests me. And one of the person who went as very far in this exploration is, of course, Gunther Anders, in a very interesting book, especially because he was talking about another threat, a threat which, by the way, is still there. No one mentioned it anymore, but it's still there. And it was called at the time the Nuclear Holocaust. And this is what is said in a book which is translated in French. I couldn't find the exact German title. We have today, and this is my translation, by the way, we have today a chance to play a new role in warning people of the apocalypse, the role of prophylactic messengers. If we differ from the classical Judeo-Christian announcers of the apocalypse, it's not only because we are afraid of the end, whereas we longed for it, but more because our apocalyptic passion has no other goal than to avoid the apocalypse. We warn of the apocalypse only to be proven wrong, only to enjoy every morning again the chance to still be around, I like the sentence, ridiculous maybe, but standing here nonetheless. So apocalypse, being in the presence of the apocalypse, is not a sort of evasion, nor is it like the old tradition of revelation, which is the etymology of the word, but as he says very well, a prophylactic, a sort of call for action. And my argument is that when you have of the apocalypse a view which is not of now, then you sort of take all these alarms as something which are of no importance, which is the theme of Anders' book and many other after the Hiroshima's event. Since I'm French, I'll give lectures in 3 parts, like Monday. We are not supposed to do lectures in 2 parts, but only in 3. And the first part will be a strange argument which you might find that bizarre around the date of 1610, but I hope I will explain why. Then I will spend a little time on this opposition and contrast of these 2 extraordinarily fragile modes, religion in the language of a mode of existence project, let's call them rel, and politics, let them call pol. And then I'd spend much more time on Voegelin, which I only recently discovered. I know it's much better known here, and I hope the question of your audience will redress some of the wrong thing. I hope I'm not going to say too many wrong things about him, but don't hesitate to refrain. And then I'll make a little test to ask you if you live before, after, or at the time of the end of time, which is my argument. And then we'll see what happens. Part 1, well, everyone knows in the history of science the date of 1610, and especially the January 10th of 1610 because of Galileo's famous discovery, and also because of Galileo's in Brecht, famous citation, which is not in real by Galileo, but it makes a very nice line. January 10th, 1610, heavens abolished. It's a very famous part of his extraordinary, interesting play, all the more interesting now when everything which is in the play, in the sort of infinite universe, is now reversed in the ecological mutation. And this is why I wrote a play about that, actually. Now, what is extraordinary is that 1610 is also a new date of the Anthropocene. It's a very fragile candidate, unfortunately. I thought it would be a good candidate, but people in the Anthropocene committee told me it's not that serious. Yet it was in the first page of Nature, the same image I showed on Monday, and I don't have to remind you of what the Anthropocene is, except to say that it's a geological period. And one of the candidates is an uncertainty of where you start the Anthropocene. It goes from 2,000 years before Christ to the 16th of July, 1945. But here in this paper by Lewis and Maslin, they propose one of the dates is 1610. And the reason is that it's a very strong decrease in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere at the time, and they scratch their head and say, why is that decrease? And that's because the forest in North America increased enormously and pumping all the CO2 in the atmosphere. And then they ask a typically Anthropocene question, how come that the forest grew so enormously in the century before 1610? And of course, they didn't have to go very far to understand that the answer was the extermination through smallpox and sword of 50 million Indians who were in the habit of actually making the America open. So this is a typically interesting case of a link between colonization, extermination of Indian, forest, CO2, a typical story of the Anthropocene. Unfortunately, the other scientists don't seem to agree on this date. It would have been nice to have this contrast between Galileo's finding the infinite universe and this date of a sort of tragedy of a link between CO2 extermination of our collective and colonization. By the way, the caravelle of colons are on the body of this strange character, which I commented on Monday. Now, 1610 is also the date of an assassination of a king, which, if you don't know anything about French history, will not be very important for you, which is Le Bon Roi Henri, namely Henry IV, who was assassinated by a guy called Ravaillac. And Ravaillac was quartered. So everyone in France knows this because you have the image of a quartered Ravaillac assassination. Now, I'd completely forgotten this date, except we read recently this very important book, which is not that well known, by Stephen Toulmin, who is an historian of science, called Cosmopolis, the Hidden Agenda of Modernity, and he dedicated a whole chapter to 1610 and the assassination of the good King Henry IV, because he tries to reinterpret what is called the scientific revolution as a counter-revolution. And here is what he says about the assassination. By 1620, people in position of political power and theological authority in Europe no longer saw Montaigne's pluralism as a viable intellectual option, any more than Henry's tolerance was for them a practical option. The humanist readiness to live with uncertainty, ambiguity, and differences of opinion had done nothing, in their view, to prevent religious conflict from getting out of hand. And don't forget that this argument about 1620 is a commentary on the long bloody war of the 30 Years' War, after 2 decades of fight in France between Catholic and Protestant. Now you have to hear this sentence with the new religious war, which we now call fundamentalism, that we are living again among. And this is the last sentence which I find really marvelous. Ergo, they inferred, it had to help cause the worsening state of affairs, namely pluralism. If skepticism let one down, certainty was more urgent. It might not be obvious that one was supposed to be certain about, this is a very ironical sentence, but uncertainty had become unacceptable. And this allows Toulmin to revise the traditional canonic history of a scientific revolution. He was himself a pretty good historian of science, specialist of casuistic, and he wrote a whole book on the history of rhetoric. What interested him is to move the scientific revolution 1 century before, sometimes at the corner of late Middle Age and Renaissance, and to consider the scientific revolution, now in quotation mark, as a counter-revolution, making the point, which is fairly obvious for historians, that what is called the 17th century in epistemological book, the Age of Reason, is the age of the 30 Years' War, and the invention of this extraordinary animal called the Leviathan, that is the new state, which embodies and incorporates precisely the question of authority in the sentence that Toulmin mentioned, that is, it's not important to know what we are actually certain about, the important is to be absolutely certain. The age of absolute certainty, which is, and that's my argument, of course, going to corrupt science, but that's not the theme today, but certainly politics and religion as well, under the sort of amalgam or fusion of a beast, of a Leviathan. And I don't need to remember German, how bloody this war was. When you read the description of a 30 Years' War, what happens now in Syria or Libya pale by comparison. So it's not a situation where we are in the age of reason and people suddenly discover science and abandon religion. They discover simultaneously blood, war at an amazing scale, and the idea that the only way to stop discussing about anything is absolute certainty, embodied simultaneously in counter-reformation, in Hobbes, and let's say in Descartes. So three sources of absolute authority which corrupt one another. And that's the Toulmin's argument. Now, what is interesting in Toulmin, and that's a very traditional element for historian of science, especially in the famous book by Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaffer on the Leviathan, is the link between that position and what they make of matter. And of course, you understand why it's so important for me, because that's precisely the link that we can make with ecology. A certain definition of absolute certainty was connected with the idea that matter is absolutely inert. Commonwealth sectarian, now these are the one against Leviathan was built, the Hobbes Leviathan was built, read any proposal to deprive physical mass of a spontaneous capacity for action or motion as going hand in hand with proposal to deprive the human mass, the lower orders, of a population of an autonomous capacity for action, and so for social independence. What strikes us now as a matter of basic physics was in their eyes all of a piece with attempt to reimpose the inequitable order of society from which they had escaped in the 1640 through Cromwell. And this is the end of a glorious revolution. Now, I ask you not to take this argument as a historical parallel, but as a philosophical or political philosophy parallel between two periods. Remember last Monday I showed the opposition between these two figures, these two Leviathan, one very well known on the left, and one which is still being invented on the right under the name of the Anthropocene. Now, what is interesting is that on the left, the Hobbesian solution is to have inert matter, a Bible that you no longer interpret yourself in any sort of sense except to keep it in the ethics and inner self, but don't try to do anything with it in terms of cosmic or political argument, because that's the civil war out of which we will grow, and absolute authority of science of a mathematical sort for Hobbes. And as you remember, this is the source of a dispute with Boyle. And of course, absolute authority of a state. Now, what is very interesting is that now we have exactly the same argument coming this time. How can we swallow, if I can say that, the idea that the Earth is not inert, but retroact to our action? And this idea that the Earth is reacting to our action is actually the source of climato-skepticism. It cannot be true. We cannot be those who have in front of us a matter which is reacting to our action. We have disputed science, not because the science itself is not objective, but because there are enough lobbies to have made the pseudo-controversy around climate so important. And unfortunately, this is where I was expecting to read the encyclic before. So far, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but Christian religion at least, and probably the same with Islam, is fairly silent on the question of geology and ecology, or was at least, some people say, criminally silent about the question. And as the states, I mentioned them Monday, you know how powerless they are, and I'm not going to say it more. So the situation which I'm interested in, which I call in my jargon cosmograms, is to understand this distribution of agencies between what we expect from God, what we expect from the soil, so to speak, nomos, what we expect from the people, what we expect from knowledge, what we are in the cosmos. And I made Monday the parallel, which I think is fairly accurate between these two moments in history where we have to reinvent what it is to be in a new situation. Now, what is interesting, I think, is that, and this was a question actually raised by people, if you remember, in the discussion on Monday, there is now not only the, let's call them climate wars, if you want, the wars around the question of climate, but we are also back to the religious war of the past, which we thought had been sort of safely solved. I don't need to remind the German. The French, I'm sure I will remember perfectly well what happened in January around the notion of freedom of journalism and laïcité and all these questions which are as important in Germany as they are in France. And at this time, we realized how ill-equipped we were to solve an absolute classical question of what we expect of religion in the state when Islam and not Christianity is mentioned. And then we discovered, to our great surprise, at least in France, that the Hobbesian solution was an armistice. It was a way of saying absolute certainty. We stopped discussing no pluralism, authority in science, politics, and religion. But it was not a negotiation treaty. It was not a peace treaty. It was a solution to stop the bloody war. It solved absolutely none of the question which we are interested in. So the second part is trying to use some of the insight of the project which have been pursued to try to understand why is it so difficult to untangle religion and politics, which are themselves so mixed together that when you try to tear them apart, you never know what you keep, because there is so much religion in politics and so much politics in religion that you cannot differentiate them as domains. Can you imagine that in France there are people who say that to be a laïc, that is to be member of a French republic, this is a sentence by Monsieur Sarkozy, you have to eat no pork. You have to eat pork, which is extraordinary. It's a civil religion. Eating pork is the only important proof that you're actually French. And if you don't eat pork, it means you're out of a republic, which is a completely bizarre definition of what it is to be laïc. A complete distortion of laicity because there is no way to understand the relation between politics and religion. It becomes a very bad civic religion. As you know, if you know anything about actor network theory, neither religion or science are domain, nor are they explained by society. Society is the result of all those associations. Some of them are produced by the connection which we call religious connection, and others by those of politics, but many others by science, technology, law, etc. The point is very important, because as long as we have a sort of Durkheimian version of the explanation of religion, behind religion we imagine that there is society somewhere. But, I mean, it's explicit in Durkheim. And of course, this renders extremely difficult to re-understand religion as a mode. Now, I cannot get into all the argument about mode of existence, but just one little thing. Politics, if you accept to consider it not as explained by society, but as a connector, as a trajectory, as a mode of telling truth, and falls in a very specific tone, if you want to use the word tone as a metaphor to understand mode, politics is about group making. If you stop talking politically, think of the adverb, if you stop talking about politically, you stop being able to produce groups, let's say. People who say we pertain or we belong, etc., etc. It has absolutely nothing to do with this other connector of extreme importance in the history, in Western history at least, which is religion and here I introduce the expression from Assmann, I will explain it later in the discussion, the very specific counter-religion argument, it's not part of a traditional religion argument, this is the great thing about Assmann, but a very highly specific argument about reaching the end of time in time, which is what out of which the elaboration by piety, by theology, by spirituality over the years in Christianity as well as in Judaism and Islam has produced what we call the other counter-religion and their question of truth and falsity. The prime is that both of those modes are extraordinarily fragile. If you stop a little bit to talk politically, you do completely something else. If you stop talking religiously, and the adverb is extremely difficult to describe, you talk and you do something completely different. And this is the reason why those two modes, who are so fragile, I find a very perverse but understandable way of connecting to one another. And this is where what I think Voegelin is trying to work out, and I will mention that in the third part of the lectures. Now, the important thing is that both are completely misunderstood by this other way of understanding connection, which I call double-click, which is defined as the career of information without transformation. Speaking politically means that when I speak to you politically, you are made by what I'm saying, a group. Speaking religiously with the adverb doesn't mean that I'm talking about religious matter or about God. It's that I'm converting you by what I say. If I fail to convert you, finished. I said nothing of interest. I'm not doing it now. Unfortunately, I'm from a Catholic tradition, so I'm never at the pulpit myself, but I think I'll do a much better speech than the most of the priests I hear on Sunday, I have to say. So I'm not doing it now. I insist, I'm not doing it. I'm just insisting, diplomatically if you want, on this very extraordinary difficulty of defining religiously, which nonetheless has been studied at length by many, many people. And the best example I know of a distance between speaking religiously and transferring double-click type information has been offered by Louis Marin in this admirable book called The Opacity of Painting. All of you know this Piero della Francesca Annunciation, but what you might not detect immediately is that if you reconstruct the perfect construction that Piero calculated, the Virgin and the angel of the Association do not actually see one another. This is what the angel sees. Now, this is not a mistake. Piero della Francesca is not someone who invented perspective, actually. So he's not making a mistake, and by mistake put the Virgin Mary behind a pillar so that she doesn't even see the saint, the angel. It's made exactly on purpose, as Marin shows, to make sure that the person who comes to pray by the Annunciation understands that the question is not information, but transformation, and that the message, which is illustrated here, as you all know, by the little dove, is actually understood as what transformed. Not only the Virgin Mary, as everybody knows, she's transformed by the salutation of the angel, but you as someone who sees the painting. And there is an enormous elaboration in Christian art, at least, around this question of how do you show what in the old theology is called dissimiles, the little implausibility of the reading which makes sure that the hiatus, which is proper to the adverb religiously, is understood, not as information transfer. I mean, the angel is not a postman. He doesn't carry a letter saying, you are going to bear a child. He says something that makes the Virgin Mary, with the help of the, no, this is not very theological, the dove plus a lot of people make the Virgin understand it as something that transforms her. And that's where the truth is, not in the mass of information which is carried from one point to the next. Now, this is a very important aspect which I studied at length when we did with many of my colleagues the work on iconoclash, because it's part of the difficulty, and this is where the word that Jan Hassmann used of counter-religion is much, I think, truer than what he thought. He used it to describe the difference between ancient religion, which he also described as cosmic religion, and the advent of the question of truth into Judaism and then Christianity. But I think there is something much deeper in counter-religion. It's this constant fight between making the hiatus visible, and being also susceptible to the destruction through iconoclasm. And I'm saying that now in the eye, of course, the horrible event of the iconoclastic destruction of the ancient ruins in Syria. But as I said Monday, Protestant and Catholic have a lot of destruction behind them. We actually, as Europeans, have a long, long, long list of destruction and iconoclastic destruction behind us. But what interests me here, to make the instability of the religious message clearer, is the ambiguity of destroying an image which is already destroyed, which is Joseph Kerner in his very important book on the reformation of the image called The Inner Iconoclasm. This is a Pietà which has been destroyed probably by revolutionary in the 18th century in France, but they destroy an image of a broken God. So the Virgin weeps because the God is broken. And there is something completely silly in breaking the Virgin head, because you add an outer iconoclasm to an inner iconoclasm. And that's the sort of furious energy which has been triggered inside counter-religion because of this difference between this constant ambiguity between inner and outer iconoclasm. And this was the object of this amazing exhibit that we did called Iconoclash, where you never know if a Castellan Pope is an attack on the Pope, ridiculing him, on the contrary, a saint image, and you never know why this guy here is actually pierced by arrows, but is sitting on top of a thing of the temple he has just destroyed. So you have this constant ambiguity. And by the way, our catalog costs a fortune, but I give a PDF free to anyone who asks me if you are interested. Because it's a very beautiful catalog, but it's never being reprinted, so I prize it. So the third part is trying to get this argument. Why is it that two highly fragile modes, which are so easy to lose, have associated themselves, so to speak, to reinforce themselves at a certain period of history, making for us absolutely implausible now to make the distinction again, even though, because of the ecological mutation, it's absolutely crucial that we again recover the capacity of speaking politically and religiously without mixing the two. I leave aside, of course, the third one, how to speak scientifically, but that would be too complicated. It seemed to me that Voegelin in the science of politics has made a very important element. I'm not going to get into the whole dispute about secularization. I take it as somewhat obvious from many different perspectives in history of science, from Toulmin, that we have never been modern. This is another argument in a way. So that the question of have we been able to secularize in the sense of being without God makes absolutely no sense, even though Blumenberg has many interesting arguments. I will side here with Schmidt. I don't have to read nothing of his sentence except the first, because you all know it. All significant concepts of a modern theory of a state are secularized theological concepts. Now, Schmidt, of course, is interested in the notion of authority. I think Voegelin leads to a different aspect of his secularization argument about the status given to matter. And of course, in any ecological question, it's the politics of matter, if I can say that does actually matter most. So there is a link, a very strange link, between the argument of secularization and the notion of a material world. My argument, and you will see that I think it's a reading, very plausible reading of Voegelin as well, is that, well, first, there is absolutely nothing material in matter. All historians of science, the whole work we did together with my colleague on technology, the whole history of the 17th century, the whole argument about objectivity, materiality is one thing. Matter is completely different. Matter is an invention, like Whitehead said, of a bifurcation of nature, some point in the 17th century, which is basically a form of idealism. So you understand why this argument is so crucial, because in ecological situation, we cannot retrieve the ecological situation with the notion of matter. Last Monday, I talked about nature. The argument is anthropologically easier with nature, but matter is exactly the same. Materiality is something. Matter is unretrievable. So it's the argument made by Voegelin with what I realize now that everybody knows that, but it's, for me, it's slightly, because of my ignorance, slightly new, the link between this argument on matter and Gnosticism. First, very important argument about of Voegelin, that when we begin to understand what makes a collective, you have at least to absorb three different types, I would say, of divinities, not to use deities, let's say, not to use the word God. The first of these types is the truth represented by the early empires. It shall be designated as cosmological truth. The second type of truth appears in the political cultures of Athens and specifically in tragedy. It shall be called anthropological truth. Forget about the words, the labels, which are fairly disturbing, but just that we need three. One for what Assmann would call religion, one for what would be called philosophy, cosmopolitism, and the third one for what Assmann would call counter-religion, and that Voegelin calls soteriological. With the understanding, the third type of truth that appears with Christianity shall be called soteriological truth. So the important argument is that for Voegelin, we never managed to have the three together. If we had the three, we would be in a civilization. We would be modest about politics, science, religion. We would live in time. Now, we never managed to do that. We, the one who is studying, that is, the Western tradition. I don't have time to develop the argument, but there are people who know Voegelin here and who will know that, I'm sure, much better than myself. What is interesting is that every time there is a civilization movement, some people forget one of the three types of truth, or as he say, opening of the soul. Cicero has the greatest difficulty understanding the gods of philosophy, even though Andreas Speer disagrees with this argument. But I reread this morning Voegelin, and the argument on Varron is fairly convincing. Augustine does not really see why there are still all those guys having Roman gods. And Hobbes, this is the most interesting passage in the book, is about Hobbes, by the way, completely misunderstand what could be the soteriological God, because, of course, for him, coming after the religious war, it was precisely the cause of a political traumatic experience. And Gnosticism is the forgetting of the three. So all of our other guys before, maybe they forget one, but the modern Gnostics, the one which for Voegelin is the equivalent, Gnostics forget the three. Here's how the argument goes. Now, I'm really sorry to speak here under the shadow, literally the shadow of Albertus Magnus, because I know absolutely nothing on Joachim the Floor, but it plays a very important role in Voegelin book. In fact, everything gets really bad with Joachim the Floor. And I'd like to know more about it than I do. This is the argument. And here you see the apocalypse and the link with matter coming in a minute. The revelation of St. John was included in the canon in spite of misgiving about its compatibility with the idea of a church. I mean, this is a very well-known problem. You are in the church, the eschaton is coming, and then it doesn't come. What do? You have to invent something which is allowing simultaneously to speak of the end of time in continuing time. And that requires the whole invention, 1,000 years of invention of what is a church that goes on in time, even though it's expecting that the end of time is. As one of my friend priest says, I celebrate the Mass every time, hoping that it will be the last Mass which I celebrate, which I found a very disturbing thought, but it's not because he expects the world to end. Well, yes, he does. No, he expects to live so strongly in the end of time. In time. See, this is the tension. And this is what Voegelin is so good at showing. It's so tense and so improbable that it will probably very easily, at the first temptation of escaping this tension, stop, which it did. So in order to understand Voegelin's argument that it stopped, you have to understand the tension. The inclusion of St. John had fateful consequence for which the revelation, with the revelation, was accepted the revolutionary annunciation of a millennium in which Christ would reign with his saint on this earth. And here is the perversion for Voegelin. Suddenly, the whole argument of the end of time in time becomes the end of time in the continuation of time. And this is, and here I need to rely in the discussion on the knowledgeable people in this audience, what he attributes to Joachim de Flore. From the exposition of Joachitic symbols, Joachim began to imagine and calculate in the future, inside the history, the advent of this transformation of history. And this is why for Voegelin he is the ancestor of a whole line of militant. He makes a long line between Joachim de Flore, and he would have very highly added the Islamist fundamentalists to it, a long line of militant, coming from exactly the same line, learning from one another, that the end of time is now in their hands. They don't live in the trembling of being in the hands of God. They are the hands of God. And that makes a very big difference from politic. This is why he says, page 193, from the exposition of Joachitic symbol, from the cursory survey of their later variants, of course Joachim was fairly orthodox. I mean, he was a bit borderline, but he was not himself criticized by the church. Two popes liked him, however, which, as Andreas said yesterday, proves nothing, because at the time the Pope were themselves fairly, well, no, I should not say that. And from their blending with the political apocalypse of a third Rome, which is the idea that there is now, after Christ, something else which is coming, which is even better than Christ, which is the Spirit, and even better than the church, which are the monks in power, the monks in power in the Spirit on their head, being for Voegelin the absolute template that will be used all the way down in history by the other type of militants. It will have become clear that the new eschatology decisively affects the structure of modern politics. And that's what I'm interested in. Now, I went further, and I apologize here. I tried to draw the argument. So, forgive me. It has been a very long year, and I'm very tired. So, I tried to make the argument visual. Remember, the whole argument is, what do you do with the end of time in time? Blue is in time, whatever is this color, I'm a bit Daltonian, so this is for yellow, is the end of time. Okay? You have to accept this argument if you want to understand my little doodle here. Now, in this drawing, what counts are discontinuities. Remember, the church is built on this idea. We are in the end of time, finished, judged. Christ has come. Christ will come back. Christ coming. No, he's not coming. We have to, so we start again. We start again. We start again. There are vast amount of beautiful spirituality and theology about this reprise, constant reprise. And of course, the great theologian of modern culture is, in my view, the French writer Charles Péguy, on which I wrote extensively. Now, this, of course, has nothing to do with version 2, which is the sort of anti-Christian, anti-religious classical argument that transcendent is somewhere there, continuous, as if time is something equally continuous, explained by causality, and which is used in the sort of vulgar argument about transcendence, spirituality and materialism. I mean, this sort of silly things we have been living through so many years. The importance in the drawing here, I'm very well known for my unreadable drawings, is the continuity. What is lost is not only the order, but it's also the discontinuity, the hiatus. And remember, all in the adverb religiously depends on the hiatus. If you lose the hiatus, you transport information, you talk about God, but it has absolutely no effect. Actually, you lie. Technically, you are a liar, because you transform religiously in talking about religion, which has nothing to do with it. So that's the second version. Now, third version You like my diagram, I'm sure. This is the easy one. This is called catastrophism. We live happily in time. We are secular. We are taken into a series of cause and effect, but something will happen at the end. We don't very much care about it. Or on the contrary, like many evangelical in America, we expect that it will come. But this doesn't modify what it is to be in this secular time. This is the important aspect. That's the third version. The fourth one is the perversity introduced, even though he was himself a great preacher and theologian, according to Voegelin, by Joachim de Flor, which is you take the notion of transcendence, but you put it in time. It's still the end of time, so it has all the same energy, beauty, fabulous enthusiasm in the etymological sense of the word, but it's still in time, which is the idea of a third realm. After God, after Christ, the third realm. And that's where utopia arrives. Why? This is where we lose the finitude. Because now we are going to have the catastrophe of losing and the transcendence, which is misplaced, says Voegelin, and the immanence, because we are trying to make politics realize the kingdom of God here. What will happen? It will fail. There is nothing in immanence, the passing of time, which can give you the end of time. The fragility of this amazing argument of counter-religion, and here counter meaning against itself, constantly having to rework itself, will be lost. This is a beautiful moment in Voegelin's book. The next question then would be, what specific uncertainty was so disturbing that it had to be overcome by the dubious mean of fallacious immanentization? Immanentization is the key word here. Immanentization has nothing to do with religion. Immanentization is taking the transcendence and imagining that it would be realized on this earth. What happened? It failed. What happened after it failed? You despise the immanence as well. And that's the cause of the ecological crisis. Not because of the argument of Lynn White that Christianity has misunderstood or spite. It has nothing to do with that. It's actually a misunderstanding of religion, especially of Christian religion. It has nothing to do with the direction of Christian religion. Lynn White his paper doesn't really need to be mentioned here, sorry. One does not have to look far afield for an answer. Uncertainty is the very essence of Christianity. And here, of course, is what I expect to read tomorrow in the encyclic of Pope Francis. Now, it's not a very papal habit to talk about Christianity as uncertainty, unfortunately. And yet, this is exactly what Voegelin points at. Uncertainty in making the distinction between end of time and continuation of time. If you stabilize this phenomenon, you're gone. You mix transcendence and immanence and you lose both, which is the diagnosis that Voegelin makes on his, this a bit long quote, but I think it's important if you don't have the book in mind. The attempt at immanentizing, the word is horrible, I agree, but the thing is horrible as well, so it's known. The attempt at immanentizing the meaning of existence is fundamentally an attempt at bringing our knowledge of transcendence into, this is the important, a firmer grip than the cognitio fidei, the cognition of faith will afford. A firmer grip. See, when you are in the end of time, you are the one who is gripped. With gnosis, you are the one who does the grip. And Gnostic experience, this is Gnosticism, a long tradition from Judaism and Christianity, which had always been there, Voegelin agrees, but which now, at the crucial moment, somewhere in the 15th century is going to be the solution, Gnostic experience offers this firmer grip insofar as they are an expansion of the soul to the point where God is drawn into the existence of man. This expansion will engage the various human faculty, and hence it is possible to distinguish a range of Gnostic varieties, etc. And from that point, Voegelin described a constant descent, I think is the word, in Gnosticism. First, of course, using Christianity itself, and then getting rid of Christianity, believing it's actually only secular. But the problem is that it's politics which is drawn into this thing. And this is why the fusion, and the passage on Hobbes is so important, the fusion between politics and religion becomes absolutely inseparable now. Because we are going to make of politics what realizes the kingdom of God. This is impossible. No one will agree. We begin to kill one another. Then the solution is the Leviathan. But the Leviathan is a very bad solution to the political because it insists on authority, not on instability. So you lose the two instabilities, the one necessary to activate speaking religiously, and which has activated the church, at least in Christianism, for 16th century. And of course you lose, which in a way, for me, is even more important, you lose the instability of politics. You replace with the implausible application of a transcendent plan into reality. And of course, you fail, and it doesn't matter if you're right or left. The politics becomes a utopia, and the application of utopia, which is a large part. Now, here's my diagram. I hope you like it, of the immanentization catastrophe. This is where we are. I like my diagram. So, we are somewhere in the middle blue thing. Behind us, there is a radical cut. If you are Christian, you say salvation. If you are secular, you will say the scientific revolution will save us from religion. Makes no difference. You are after. The lights come. Enlightenment of the light of Christ doesn't matter very much. It's behind you. In front of you, there is not the very humble passage of time. This is not enough for you. You politics, you religious, you political religious, you political theology. No, it's not enough. What you want is the realization of the kingdom of God, or the realization of science, of reason, whatever. So you notice that now what is taken for the passage of time is the utopia of realizing the transcendence. But the transcendence is lost. And what is important for me is that what is lost now is the earth, the soil, the materiality, which then reuse what has always been a part of Gnosticism, but which has been somewhat not so important, but become absolutely crucial with the 17th century, which is that matter is simultaneously idealism plus something which has no meaning, absolutely devoid of meaning. So you now enter the modern world. People obsessed by a version of matter which is actually an idealist version of what is materiality, and despising it because it has absolutely no meaning, which is, of course, an absolutely essential aspect of Gnosticism, the spite from the word. And yet, you are after the revelation or the revolution of science. It doesn't matter the difference. So, now is the ecological crisis coming. Here are scientists warning people that the world in which they are, in the blue sense, that is in the continuation of time, traditional version, will end. Now, these people who live in America or Germany or France, you cannot tell them that there is a second apocalypse. The apocalypse is finished. I mean, the question of apocalypse, we are secular. We are after the scientific revolution. Modernism is our due. You cannot tell us that the world is going to end. It has already ended, in a way. This is Gunther Anders' argument. People are quiet. You are quiet. Why are you so quiet? The world will end. No, you cannot tell that to people. It's nothing, nowhere is it written that there are two apocalypses. You see the strange mixture, which is very odd. Of course, there are many other reasons to understand climato-skepticism. Lobbies of oil and coal spend $1 billion in the US alone every year to convince people that it's bunk. So there are lots of reasons, but there is a theological, absolutely essential reason into that. Is that we are in a world of matter which has nothing to do with materiality. We are suddenly coming from scientists, geologists, climatologists, people who are not theologians or philosophers or anthropologists, warning about an end to the inertness of matter, let's say. That is the possibility of the critical zone, as they say in geology, reacting to our action. This is not supposed to happen. Materiality, matter is something which is inert. So you see the link with the 17th century. How can we retrieve? How can we retrieve the first version, which I take as the orthodox version, that is, simultaneously we need the end of time. This is Anders' time, Anders' version. We need to be in the end of time in order to obtain the hiatus of time itself. In other words, we have to live in the instability and in the sort of fragility of counter-religion. And we need, nonetheless, to be able to retrieve the capacity of politics. We don't want to mix the production of polity with the question of the end of time. We want to be humble in politics as well as in religion. And of course, there is a beautiful example or counter-example of that. I don't know if you have seen here in Germany this beautiful book by Abdurrahman Sissako in 2015 called Timbuktu. Was it shown here in Germany? It's an extraordinary film for lots of reasons, because it was made by Sissako, is a great cineast. But there is one extraordinary moment, which is exactly the sort of commentary on Voegelin, even though it doesn't speak precisely of Islamist militant, but it's exactly there. So here on the left side, there is the old Imam of Timbuktu, and here on the right arrives one of his people we now know so well and too well on television every day, the fundamentalist. And the guy on the right is furious because the Imam is preaching against the jihad. And the man on the right says, "You want to forbid us to do jihad." And the old Imam does that with the head and say, "I could not do something like that. I've been trying to wage a jihad on myself for 65 years. I'm not going to tell you anything." And the other, instead of understanding this as a lesson about Islam, is actually accusing the old Imam of not understanding Islam. So here we have a two version, which Voegelin so beautifully shows, on Christianity, not on Islam. But it's exactly the same argument. The one on the left is in the hands of God. The one on the right is the hand of God. It's a small difference. But the one on the right think he is allowed to be simultaneously religiously right, politically efficient, and he can condemn, judge, and actually assassinate the people in Timbuktu. The one on the left is uncertain, trembling, as he says several times in the film, trembling about understanding what God means. So this is a very important, of course it's not a question of one is religious and the other is secular. Although you could say that the one on the right may be secular in sort of modernizing a very strange idea. Still, I mean, the sort of amalgam between religious and politics is complete for the one on the right, and it's still two different types of opening of the soul, as Voegelin would say, for the one on the left. Okay, well, I think I finished with this. So, you understand that the instability of religion is such, and the instability of politics is such. Politics is so fragile. It's so difficult to talk politically. It's so quick to transform a political action into the transport of order or force, obviously. That they are going to be, so to speak, an amalgam, which Voegelin, the whole book of Voegelin, The New Science of Politics, is precisely on this amalgam, where simultaneously the fragility of politics and the fragility of religion will sort of support one another and betray and religion and politics simultaneously. We lose both. So this is why it's impossible to separate them as domain, because what we mean by politics is utopian application of implausible transcendence, and what we talk about religion is complete transformation of transcendence into belief. Nothing, absolutely nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with politics. The domains are extraordinarily badly built. And this is what happens, according to Voegelin, somewhere at the time of Hobbes. This is why I showed the connection between Hobbes now. On the other hand, when the Gnostic sectarian movement gained momentum in the 12th century, before, I mean, in this passage is making the story coming from Joachim the Floor to Hobbes, the church cooperated, because he's trying to understand why is it that the church abandoned itself, its own position about the trembling and the uncertainty. And here is accusing the Inquisition, actually, a very specific moment in which is La Croisade des Albigeois in French. I don't know how to say it in English. The fight against the Cathars, with the civil power in the persecution of heretic. It leaned strongly toward its function as the agent of a theologia civilis, and thereby became untrue to its essence as the representative of a civitas Dei in history, just like the Imam and the jihadists we saw. The tension finally reached the breaking point when a plurality of schismatic churches and the Gnostic movement entered into violent competition for existential representation. The vacuum now became manifest in the religious civil war, and we are not out of that. There has been an armistice, but now it's coming back with the new religious war and coming back to with the ecological mutation. So, here's the little test. Do you live before? Living before the apocalypse is very difficult now for people who have been modernized. It would mean you know nothing about modernity, never heard of Christianity, never heard of science and the scientific revolution, never heard of a hype of technology, so I think it's improbable that you will listen to me. So I assume that the choice is rather between after or at the time of the end of time. If you are after, I'm not asking you for an answer. This is between your consciousness and yourself, if I can say that. If you're after, this is why you're so quiet. Nothing can happen to you, basically. You are modern and you are untitled to modernism. So, if you are in the situation described by Gunther Anders. You tremble. And now, you tremble 3 times. No, you have 3 sources of trembling at least. One about God, that is, uncertainty is the importance of counter-religion. Religions are counter themselves, so to speak. About science, not because of the artificial controversy, just because it's very, very difficult to know. And the institution of science is amazingly fragile and can be very easily destroyed. But you tremble even more because we have lost and we are losing very, very fast the ability of being political. And here's the portrait of the modern, which I leave you sort of a, let's say, a Neurath type of diagram of the 1930s. This is you. Thank you very much.